Welcome to Dad's Revenge, where quiet men prove that patience is a strength. Each story here is about a father who is underestimated, disrespected, or betrayed by the very people who should be protecting him, and how that father finds his own way to mend things. Welcome to today's story. My stepson waited until the church had gone quiet before he reached over and shut off the last song my wife and I ever recorded together. We were sitting in the front pew of Greater Faith Baptist on the east side of Detroit. The choir had just finished. The pastor had nodded to the sound booth, and my old reel of Denise singing began to play through the speakers. It was a gospel number we cut in 1982, back when the studio was just a garage with egg cartons stapled to the walls. Her voice filled that sanctuary like warm light through stained glass, and for the first time in 3 days, I felt her next to me again. Then the music stopped. I turned my head. Cameron had leaned across the aisle and pressed something on his phone that was patched into the board. He straightened his tie and whispered to the young man running sound, loud enough for the front rows to hear that the recording was cheap and outdated, and it was, quote, killing the mood. Killing the mood. At his own mother's memorial. My name is Isaiah Boyd. I am 69 years old. For 40 years, I built Boyd Sound and Radio from a borrowed microphone and a second-hand mixing console into the loudest, proudest, black-owned station this city has ever known. Station WBOY, the voice of the neighborhood. But to my stepson Cameron and his wife Sasha, I was just the old man who smelled like solder and never learned to wear the right suit. Before I tell you how I taught that boy the most expensive lesson of his life, do me a favor. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if you have ever poured your whole life into something only to have a person half your age call it worthless, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Because this story is for you. The disrespect started before the flowers on her casket had even begun to wilt. I had raised Cameron since he was 9 years old. I taught him to ride a bike on Mack Avenue. I paid for the braces, the private school, the fancy business degree he now waved around like a badge. His mother Denise and I gave that boy everything 2 working people could scrape together. And there he sat in a suit that cost more than my first car, checking his phone during the eulogy, annoyed that grief was slowing down his schedule. When the service ended, I stood by her casket a long while. I did not want to leave her there in the cold. I owed her more than that. Denise was the reason the station ever survived. She worked the phones, kept the books, sang on the demos when we could not afford talent. She believed in me on the nights I stopped believing in myself. Standing there, I made her a quiet promise. I told her I would keep the peace. I told her I would try to hold this family together. I did not know yet that the family was already gone. Cameron came up beside me, checking his watch. He put a hand on my shoulder, but there was no warmth in it. He told me we needed to move things along, that people were waiting at the house, that the caterers charged by the hour. He said it the way a man talks about a traffic jam, not about his mother, about an inconvenience. I looked at him, then really looked. The boy I had carried on my shoulders was standing in a house of God, and there was nothing behind his eyes but appointments and ambition. I did not see a son. I saw a stranger who had learned to wear my family's name. I walked out of that church into a gray November wind that cut straight through my coat, and I felt the whole city humming around me. The traffic, the church bells, the distant sound of a radio playing in a passing car. Sound was the one thing I had always understood. I could hear a bad connection in a wire before a meter ever caught it. I could tell you which mic a man was talking into with my eyes closed. 40 years, and I still knew where every wire led. That gift was the only thing Cameron could not take from me. He thought Boyd Sound and Radio was a building and a logo and a stack of contracts. He thought he had inherited an empire. What that boy did not understand was that he had only inherited the microphone. He had not inherited the signal. He did not own a single master tape in that vault. He did not hold the broadcast license. He did not know that 10 years ago, while he was away at school, learning to talk down to men like me, I had quietly moved every piece of real value into a place his lawyers would never think to look. He thought he was throwing out the trash. He was handing away the keys to the kingdom. I climbed into my old pickup truck, the same one I have driven for 30 years. And I let the engine settle into its familiar rumble. Across the parking lot, Cameron slid into a black car, and never once looked back at the church. I gripped the wheel, and I whispered a promise to my wife, the same as I had whispered at her graveside. But this one was different. Come Sunday night, I told her this whole city is going to hear nothing but static, and every last soul in it is going to wonder where the music went. The repast was supposed to be a place of comfort. Instead, Cameron turned my wife's memorial dinner into a corporate mixer. We held it at the house Denise and I had bought together, a modest brick home off Outer Drive, filled with 30 years of music and memory. But when I walked through my own front door, it did not feel like morning. The lights were too bright. Somebody had put on the same soulless lounge music Cameron piped into his meetings. The people crowding my living room were not our neighbors or the artists we had raised over the decades. They were consultants and lawyers in sharp clothes, drinking my good bourbon and talking about market share. I picked up a spoon and tapped it against a glass. I wanted to tell them how Denise used to hum into the studio microphone at 2 in the morning to keep the young singers calm. I got as far as thanking everyone for coming. Then Cameron stepped in front of me. He clapped his hands together, and the room turned toward him like he was the one they had come to see. He thanked them for supporting the family in this difficult time. Then he smiled that practiced smile, the one that never reached his eyes, and told them that as of that morning, with the board's blessing, he was stepping in as the new head of Boyd Sound and Radio. Effective immediately. There was polite applause. My hand tightened around the glass. We had not even read Denise's will, but Cameron was not finished. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick envelope, holding it toward me in front of every stranger in that room. It was not a gift, it was a prop. He said the company was moving in a new digital direction, that the neighborhood station was a relic, and it was time for me to rest. Inside the envelope, he told the room was a very generous retirement package. He actually called it a golden parachute. The house went quiet. This was an execution, and he was carrying it out over my wife's funeral flowers. I looked at the envelope. I did not take it. I asked him quietly what he thought he was doing. He leaned in close so only I could hear, and the mask slipped. He told me I was an old man who fixed radios. He said the sound of my voice on the air made the station sound like a funeral. I looked past him and saw Sasha in the corner sipping wine, watching me with a little smile. She gave me a small wave with her fingers. That was when I understood. This had not been decided that morning. It had been planned for months. They had been waiting for Denise to die. I took the envelope. I did not open it. I already knew what was inside. An insult with a $sign on it. Then Cameron snapped his fingers, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out from my own hallway. I did not know them. For 40 years, I knew every man who ever worked security for me. These 2 were strangers. Muscle hired for the occasion. Cameron announced loud enough for the room that since I was no longer an executive, he could not have me on the premises. And since the house he claimed now passed to him, he was going to have to ask me to leave. Leave. My own home, where Denise had died in the back bedroom 4 days earlier. One of the strangers put a hand on my elbow. It was a light touch, but the meaning was heavy. I pulled my arm free. I did not need help walking out of the house I had paid for with 40 years of late nights. I straightened my tie. I looked at Cameron, at the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and I saw a stranger wearing a costume. I told him, calm as I could, that the signal he was sitting on was louder than he thought. He laughed. He told me to go enjoy my retirement, go fishing, and leave the real work to the professionals. I nodded slowly. I gripped that envelope and told him one last thing before I turned away. I said, "Be careful, son. That chair you are so proud of runs on a current you cannot see, and you do not hold the switch." Then I walked to my own front door and let those 2 strangers follow me out into the cold, like I was a burglar. The door shut behind me with a heavy, final sound. I stood on my porch in the November dark, a 69-year-old man, freshly widowed, freshly fired, holding an insult in my coat pocket. Most men might have broken down right there, might have pounded on the wood and begged. I am not most men. I walked down the driveway slow and steady and reached into my pocket. Not for the envelope, for the small silver flash drive I have carried on my keychain for 10 years. Cameron thought the company was buildings and logos and bank accounts. He forgot about the paperwork. He forgot that while he was away at school, I had quietly moved every master tape and every license into a holding company his lawyers had never heard of. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Renata answered on the second ring. She had been my attorney for 20 years, and she already knew about the funeral. She started to offer her condolences. I stopped her gently. I told her to save it. Then I said 4 words I had prepared for a very long time. Initiate protocol static. There was a pause on the line. Then her voice came back sharp and certain. She asked if I was sure. Once we started, she reminded me there was no turning back. I looked back at the house at the warm light where Cameron was raising a glass of my bourbon to a room full of strangers. I am sure, I told her. He wants to run a radio station. Let us see how he does it with no signal. I hung up and walked out into the dark, listening to the whole city hum around me. The brass handle on the front door of WBOY had been polished by my own hands for 40 years. On Monday morning, it felt cold and foreign, like it belonged to someone else's building. I had arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. I parked in the visitor lock because I knew my reserved spot by the door would already be taken. I climbed the concrete steps I had climbed 10,000 times, and I pulled open the door to the station I had built from a garage. The smell hit me first. For years, that lobby had smelled of fresh coffee and warm electronics, of a place where music was made. Now it smelled sterile, like ozone, and some expensive perfume with no soul in it. I walked to the security gate and pulled my badge from my pocket. It was worn soft at the edges from 1,000 early mornings. I held it to the scanner the way I always had. The machine let out a harsh, low buzz. The light flashed red. I tried again. Buzz. Red. I looked at the little screen. It did not say error. It said card deactivated. A young woman I had never seen before called out from the front desk. She told me I could not be in this area without a pass. Miss Ruthie, who had run that desk for 20 years and knew every artist's birthday, was gone. In her place sat a stranger looking at me over designer glasses, annoyed that I had interrupted her morning. I kept my voice level. I told her my name was Isaiah Boyd. I told her I had founded this station and I was here to collect my thing. She typed for a moment and frowned. She said there was no Isaiah Boyd in the active directory and I would have to wait by the wall while she called management to verify my story. Verify my story. In my own house. I looked up at the wall behind her. The framed photograph of the first transmitter we ever raised. Denise and me standing under the tower in the summer heat was gone. In its place hung a bright neon sign that simply said the word "Disrupt" in hot pink letters. This was not my station anymore. It had become a playground for children who had never soldered a single wire in their lives. I waited. 5 minutes. Then 10. Employees passed through the lobby, people I had hired, people whose rent I had covered in the hard winters. They looked at the floor. They looked at their phones. They looked anywhere but at me. Fear is a powerful silence. Cameron had clearly made an example of anyone loyal to the old way. Finally, the elevator opened, and it was not Cameron who stepped out. It was Sasha. She wore a white suit that probably cost more than my father earned in a year. Her heels struck the marble in a sharp, aggressive rhythm. She was not carrying a folder or a clipboard. She was carrying a cardboard box. A plain brown beat-up box. She stopped a few feet away. She did not say hello. She did not offer one word of comfort for the mother-in-law we had just buried. She looked at me with a mix of pity and disgust like I was a stain on her clean carpet. She told me in a voice dripping with false sweetness that they had figured I might show up. So she had taken the liberty of packing my office herself. They could not have me wandering the halls, she said, disrupting the workflow while they pivoted to the new model. She held the box out, but she did not hand it to me. She simply let go. The box hit the floor with a heavy thud that echoed through the silent lobby. I heard the sharp crack of glass breaking inside. "Oops," she said, covering her mouth with a manicured hand, her eyes dancing. Her grip must have slipped. She did not know why I kept so much junk in an office anyway. It cluttered the aesthetic. I looked down. Lying on top, half spilled out, was a framed photograph. It was Denise and me on the day we first went on the air in 1982, standing in front of that garage studio covered in dust and grinning like we owned the whole world. The glass over Denise's face was shattered. A jagged crack ran right through her smile. I bent down slowly. My knees ached, but I did not let it show. I picked up the frame. I brushed the glass shards from her face with my thumb. I told Sasha, quiet and steady, that this was not junk. This was history. She snapped that history did not pay the bills. They were rebranding, she said, getting rid of the dusty old neighborhood image, and that included me and my sentimental clutter. She gestured around the lobby and said they were going to paint it all clean and white and modern. No more war stories from old men about the good old days. I stood back up, holding the broken frame against my chest. I looked at this hollow woman who had married my stepson. She thought power was about furniture and paint and logos. She had no idea that power is about leverage. I told her I would go, but I told her to remember one thing. You can paint over these walls, I said, but you cannot paint over the sound. And I am the man who built the sound. Before she could answer, the front doors slid open behind me. Cameron walked in, flanked by the same two hired strangers. He looked rested and pleased with himself. He saw the box on the floor and smirked and said he was glad Sasha had handled the trash. Then he held out his hand palm up and told me there was one more thing he needed from me. He wanted the keys. Cameron wanted the keys to my truck, and when I would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction, he asked for the phone too. He explained loud enough for the lobby to hear that the pickup was a company vehicle now, and the phone bill ran through the station. Neither was true, but I did not argue. That old truck was mine, paid off decades ago, but I understood what he was doing. He wanted to leave me on the curb with a box of broken glass, no way to drive, no way to call for help. He wanted to watch me break. I reached into my pocket. I took out the phone I had already wiped clean the night before thanks to protocol static. It was just plastic and glass, now empty as a dead microphone. I placed it in his open palm. I kept the truck keys. The truck was in my name, and I told him so plainly, and something in my voice made him decide not to press it in front of witnesses. He closed his fist around the phone and told me to enjoy the real world. He said it was cold out there. Then he told the two strangers to walk me off the property, and if I stopped or looked back, to call the police. I bent down and picked up the cardboard box. It was heavy with 30 years of memory. I held it in one arm and the broken photograph of Denise in the other, and I turned my back on Cameron and Sasha, and I walked out the door I had built. One of the young engineers, a good kid named Marcus, whom I had trained myself, looked like he wanted to say something. I saw the shame in his eyes. I gave him a small nod, letting him know I did not blame him. He had a baby at home. A man has to feed his family. Outside, the November rain had started thin and cold. I did not look for a taxi. I walked to my truck, set the box on the passenger seat, and placed Denise's broken picture carefully on top. Then I sat there for a moment, listening to the rain drum on the roof, and I let myself feel it, just for a minute. Then I turned the key and the engine answered me the way it always had, low and honest, and I pulled out into the gray. I did not drive to Lake Forest or any fine hotel. I drove south, back to a part of Detroit where the streetlights flicker and the sirens sing all night. I had rented a small apartment there under a name Cameron's lawyers would not find. A third-floor walk-up over a shuttered record shop. The wallpaper was peeling, the radiator clanked and hissed. It smelled of old coffee and older cigarettes. But as I set my box down on that sagging floor, I did not feel fear. I felt something closer to memory. This was the kind of place where Denise and I had started counting quarters to buy tape and tubes, dreaming out loud in the dark. In the suburbs, the silence had been expensive. Down here, the noise was free and it was real. I set the broken photograph on the small wobbly nightstand. Even through the cracked glass, her smile lit up that dim little room. I touched her face through the jagged line. They took the house, Denise, I told her. But they cannot take the home we built inside each other. I stood at the window and looked down at the street. A couple of kids stood on the corner under a busted streetlight, laughing, their breath fogging in the cold. A city bus groaned past. A car rolled by with the windows down, gospel radio spilling out into the night, and I recognized the station right away. It was not WBOY. It was one of our competitors. Even the little things told me the same story. Cameron had already started to lose the sound. I want to stop here and speak to you plainly, whoever you are listening tonight. Maybe you know what this feels like. Maybe you gave 40 years to a job, to a company, to a family. And one day, somebody half your age in a nicer suit looked right through you and decided you were finished. Maybe they called you outdated, a relic, a dinosaur. Maybe you nodded and swallowed it and drove home in the rain like I did, wondering if the world had simply moved on without asking your permission. If that is you, then hear me. Being underestimated is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the quiet before you show them exactly who you are. A patient man is not a weak man. Sometimes silence is just a fuse burning down. I sat on the edge of that thin mattress, and I did not weep. I prayed. I thanked God for the years He gave me with Denise, and I asked Him for the strength to do what was coming without letting it turn my heart to stone. Because I did not want revenge for the sake of cruelty. I wanted justice. There is a difference, and a man my age had better know it. My stomach growled. I had not eaten in a day. I unwrapped a sandwich from the corner store and ate it slow, sitting in a cheap wooden chair by the window, a millionaire on paper, eating cold turkey in a room that cost less than Cameron's shoes. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. The laughter died in my throat when I heard a knock at the door. I went still. Almost nobody knew where I was. I had paid cash. I had used another name. I crossed the small room and looked through the peephole. The lens bent the face on the other side, but I would have known that battered old cap anywhere, and the man twisting it nervously in his big scarred hands. I opened the door, and the sight of him standing there trembling broke something loose in my chest. Standing in my doorway, twisting his cap in his hands, was the best drummer this city ever produced, and he was crying. His name is Willie Turner, but everyone at the station has called him Pops for 30 years. He is 71 years old. He lost the sight in his left eye in a factory accident before I ever met him, and it never once slowed his hands. Pops was the first musician I ever recorded in that garage. He laid down the beat on half the records that made WBOY famous. He could hear a flaw in a mix that no meter would ever catch. And now he stood in the hallway of that run-down building shaking, wearing his old station jacket with the name patch torn clean off, leaving a dark square over his heart. I brought him inside and sat him down in my one good chair. I did not have much to offer, but I put the kettle on. Pops looked around that little apartment with his one good eye, and he did not judge it. He just lowered himself down slow and stared at his worn boots. "They let me go, Isaiah," he said. His voice cracked right down the middle. I already knew Cameron was clearing house, but Pops was the heart of that place. You do not run a sound operation without the man who can hear the truth in a room. I asked him why. I asked if they even gave a reason. He let out a bitter little laugh and pulled a crumpled paper from his coat. He smoothed it on his knee like it might bite him. It was a termination notice. The reason typed across it was failure to adapt to new technical standards. Technical standards, I said. Pops, you can tune a live board by feel in the dark. You are the best ears in the state. He told me it did not matter anymore. Cameron had brought in consultants who handed everyone tablets and told them every cue, every level, every log had to be entered into some new cloud system by hand. Pops tried. Lord knows he tried. But his fingers are thick and slow with arthritis now, and he cannot see the small print on a screen with one eye. He pressed the wrong buttons. He could not move through the menus fast enough. Then he told me the part that turned the cold in my chest into fire. Cameron had come down to the studio floor that morning. He had watched Pops fumble with the tablet, this 71-year-old man who had given the station his whole life. And Cameron laughed. He turned to his assistant right there in front of everyone, and he said, "Get rid of these fossils. If they cannot swipe a screen, they cannot work for me." Then he leaned down close to Pops and said, "No offense, old-timer, but I need people who can actually see the future." To a blind man. He said that to a blind man. And it was not just Pops. Cameron had fired the whole senior crew in one morning. Old Sam from the transmitter, Miss Loretta who ran traffic for 30 years, every engineer over the age of 50. Anyone who did not fit the look he wanted for his brand new brand. No notice, no severance. He told them that since they could not use the new system, they were in breach of their contracts. Pops put his face in his big hands. He told me his wife needs her insulin. He told me he was 2 years short of drawing his pension, and now that was gone too. He asked me who on God's earth was going to hire a half-blind 71-year-old drummer who cannot work an iPad. I stood up from that mattress, and I felt something settle in me that had not settled in years. The grief was still there, but underneath it now was a steady, white heat. This was no longer just business. Cameron was not simply stealing a company. He was taking the bread out of the mouths of the people who built it. He was erasing the men and women who gave that station its soul and replacing them with an app. That is not modernizing. That is a sin against decency. I put my hand on Pop's shoulder. His jacket smelled of cigarettes and cymbals, and honest sweat the smell of 40 years of work. "Willie," I said, "you go home to your wife tonight. You tell her Isaiah says everything is going to be all right. You tell her that insulin is not going to lapse, not one day." He looked up at me confused. He said I was out too. He said I was sitting in a dump with a box of broken glass. How could I help anybody? I smiled at him a hard and quiet smile. I told him I was down, but I was a long way from out. And I was not broke no matter what Cameron believed. He thought he took my power because he took my chair. He forgot that I own the ground that chair sits on. I picked up the prepaid phone I had bought at the corner store and dialed Renata from memory. She answered on the first ring, sharp and ready. I told her Cameron had fired the entire senior crew. I told her he had fired Pops Willie. The line went quiet. Renata knew Pops. She knew he was family. Then she said something that made me go still. She asked if I realized what that meant. Under our broadcast license, she reminded me, the station is required by federal law to keep a certified senior engineer on staff at all times. Pops was one of only 2 men who held that certification. I looked at Pops sitting there in that chair, wiping his eye with a shop rag. "I know exactly what it means," I told her. "By firing that man Cameron just took his own station off the air. Legally. He simply does not know it yet." Then I told her to move $50,000 from my personal trust into Willie's account that night, and to call it a consulting fee. I needed him ready. Ready for what Pops asked, standing up a little hope creeping back into his voice. "Ready to get back to work?" I said. "Go home, Willie. Get some sleep. Come Sunday, we are going back on the air." After Pops Willie left that night, I sat alone in the dark with the prepaid phone and called Renata back because I needed to hear her say out loud what I already knew in my bones. She had the file open before I even asked. 20 years as my attorney had taught her how my mind worked. She told me to sit down, and then she read me the language I had written into the founding papers of Boyd Sound and Radio a decade earlier, back when I moved every real asset into the holding company and left the operating side a hollow shell. The operating company, she reminded me, does not own a single thing of value. It does not own the transmitter. It does not own the master tapes locked in the vault. It does not even own the name WBOY. All of it belongs to Boyd Legacy Holdings, and every month the station pays my holding company a licensing fee to use those assets. Cameron thought he had inherited a kingdom. What he had actually inherited was a tenant with a very expensive lease. Then she read me the part that mattered. The master lease, she said, was written with conditions, 3 of them, and the moment any one of those conditions was broken, I had the legal right to recall every asset immediately. Condition number 1. The station must maintain its federal broadcast license in good standing, which requires a certified senior engineer on staff at all times. Renata paused, and I could hear the smile spreading into her voice. Cameron, she said, had just fired both certified engineers on the payroll, Pops Willie and Old Sam. As of that morning, WBOY was broadcasting without a legally required engineer. The operating company was in violation of federal law, and more to the point, in breach of my lease. I closed my eyes and let that settle. It was almost too perfect. In his rush to throw away the old men, Cameron had not fired a drummer and a technician. He had unplugged his own station from the wall and never heard the click. I asked her about the other conditions. She read them too. Condition number 2, the company had to remain financially solvent and keep the reserve accounts funded. Condition number 3, no legal action could be taken against me, the holder of the intellectual property, without automatically voiding the license. 3 doors, I said, and he has already walked through the first one. Renata told me she could draft the recall order that very night. Once I signed it, she could freeze the whole operation before the sun came up. She was ready to end it right there. But I told her to wait. She went quiet on the line. She knew me well enough to know I was not being merciful. I was being patient. There is a difference, and it matters. I did not want to simply shut Cameron down in the dark of a Monday night where he could spin some story about a technical glitch and a bitter old stepfather sabotaging the future. I wanted the whole city watching when the truth came down. I wanted him standing on a stage bragging at the exact moment the ground opened under his feet. Because I knew that boy. I knew what he was going to do next. He had spent months whispering about a big digital future, about partnerships and streaming, and leaving the neighborhood behind. He had been circling a company called NovaStream for the better part of a year. NovaStream is a distribution giant, the kind of outfit that swallows local catalogs whole and pays pennies on the dollar. I had turned them down flat 5 years ago. I had read their contract, and it was a vampire deal. All the risk on the local side, and all the control on theirs. Cameron did not read contracts. Cameron signed things. He liked the sound of his own name on a big line. So I told Renata to hold the recall order in her drawer. Let him have his press conference, I said. Let him stand up in front of the cameras and the investors and announce his shiny new future. Let him sign the deal that puts a national spotlight on everything he is about to lose. When the spotlight is brightest, I told her, that is when we turn off the lights. She understood. She said she would prepare the recall order and the cease and desist and hold both until I gave the word. Then she asked me one more question, careful and quiet. She asked if I was truly prepared for what came after. Freezing the operation would cost real money. Contracts would break. Trucks of equipment would sit idle. The station could go dark for days. It could bankrupt the operating company entirely. I looked over at the broken photograph of Denise on the nightstand, her smile split by that jagged crack. And I thought about Pops Willie counting out his wife's insulin. I do not care about the money, I told her. I built that station from nothing once. I can build it again if I have to. But I will not let that boy use my life's work to starve the people who gave it their own. Draft the papers, Renata, and keep your phone close this week. It is going to ring at strange hours. She said she would. Before she hung up, she told me to get some rest. I did not rest. I sat by the window a long time, listening to the city, thinking about a boy on a stage who was about to sign his own eviction notice in gold ink and call it the future. 2 days later, I watched my stepson sign his own death warrant on live television, and he smiled the whole time he did it. I did not have to sneak into the room. Cameron made sure the whole city was invited. He had been teasing his big announcement all week on the very airwaves I built, calling it the deal that would drag WBOY into the future. So on Wednesday afternoon, I sat in my little apartment in that cheap wooden chair by the window, and I watched it unfold on a second-hand television I had bought at a pawn shop for $20. The local business channel carried it live. They called it a landmark partnership for Detroit media. The camera showed a hotel ballroom full of reporters and cameras, and young people in expensive clothes. Cameron stood at a podium next to a man named Grayson, the head of acquisitions for NovaStream. Grayson had the smile of a man who had already counted your money and decided it was his. I knew NovaStream well. 5 years back, they had come to me with the same pitch, promising to take our whole catalog national. I read their contract cover to cover, and I sent them home. It was a vampire deal. They wanted the master recordings, the licensing rights, everything that made us who we were. And in exchange, they offered pennies and a penalty clause sharp enough to cut a man in half. I said no. Cameron was about to say yes with a grin. On the table in front of them sat two thick leather binders, the contracts. And here's the thing that Cameron, in all his fancy schooling, never understood. NovaStream is lazy. Grayson would not have written the new agreement from scratch. He would have pulled the old template from our negotiation 5 years ago, the one built around my standards because he believed those standards guaranteed quality. Somewhere deep in that binder, in an appendix nobody in that ballroom would ever read, sat a clause requiring that every master delivered be verified as authentic by the certified rights holder. The certified rights holder. Not the operating company, not Cameron, me. I leaned toward the screen. Cameron picked up a gold pen and held it up for the cameras, letting the flashbulbs pop. He did not open the binder. He did not turn to the appendix. He did not read a single line of fine print. He talked instead about disruption, about synergy, about leaving the dusty past behind. He said the neighborhood station was becoming a national brand. Then he signed, big and bold, the way he did everything, his name sprawling across the line like he was autographing a poster of himself. Grayson signed next, and I saw the look on Grayson's face, the look I have seen on 100 sharks over 40 years in this business. He knew. He knew Cameron was an amateur who had just fired his entire technical crew. He was not partnering with WBOY. He was setting the table to eat it. The room burst into applause. Flashbulbs lit up the stage. Cameron pulled Sasha in beside him, and she beamed for the cameras in a dress that sparkled under the lights, hungry for every photograph. They looked like royalty. They looked untouchable. I did not clap. I did not smile. I sat perfectly still and I watched a boy promise the world something he could no longer deliver. Because here is what Cameron had just committed to in front of God and every camera in Detroit. NovaStream contracts demand a guarantee of authenticated masters delivered clean, verified by the rights holder on a strict schedule with brutal penalties for failure. Cameron had just promised to hand over a catalog he did not legally own, verified by a certification he could not obtain, maintained by engineers he had thrown out into the cold that very week. He had signed a contract that required certified expert authentication days after banning the only certified experts from the building. He thought he was stepping into the digital age. In truth, he had just walked straight into a bear trap and pulled the jaws shut behind him. I turned off the television, and for a moment I saw my own reflection in the dark glass. I was not grinning like a man who had won. My face was still and quiet. There was no joy in this, only a cold and steady certainty, the kind that settles over a man when he watches a storm roll in that he knows is coming and cannot stop. I thought about the schedule buried in that contract. The first master authentication was due the following week. It could not happen. There was no one left in that building who could make it happen, and the only man who could authorize it was sitting in a rented room on the south side of the city, wiped off the payroll, erased from the directory, driving a 30-year-old truck. I picked up the prepaid phone and sent a single message to Pops Willie. It said, "It is done. Get the old crew ready." The reply came back in seconds. "We are ready, boss." I set the phone down and looked out at the darkening sky. Another storm was coming in off the lake, heavy and gray, and I thought that was fitting. But the storm outside was nothing next to the one about to land on Cameron's brand new glass desk. "Enjoy the champagne tonight, son," I said to the empty room. "Drink every drop. Because that gold pen you were so proud of, you did not sign a partnership with it. You signed your own eviction notice." The fleet was bleeding, but the new captain was too busy admiring his reflection to notice the wound. It started on a Thursday night in the dead of the coldest week of the year, with a sound no radio man ever wants to hear. Silence. I heard about it the way I heard about everything now, from the old crew who still had friends inside the building. But I did not need them to tell me. I had a scanner and a radio, and I was listening to WBOY myself that night, the way I had every night of my life. The evening gospel hour was on the show Denise used to love, the one that carried old folks across the city through their loneliest hours. Around 9 o'clock, the music began to stutter. A digital hiccup, the kind of glitch that happens when an automation system loses its footing. In the old days, this was nothing. Pops or old Sam would have caught it in the first half-second, tapped the right relay, and rerouted the signal before a single listener noticed. That was the whole point of keeping men in the building who could hear trouble coming. But there were no such men in the building anymore. The stutter grew into a skip. Then the skip stretched into a long, ugly gap. And then, for the first time in 40 years, WBOY went silent. Dead air. Across the whole east side of Detroit, in kitchens and hospital rooms and lonely apartments, the gospel simply stopped, and there was nothing but the low hiss of an empty frequency. I sat forward in my chair. I knew exactly what had failed. It was the automation relay in the master control room, an old and temperamental piece of equipment that needed a human hand and a good ear to nurse it through the cold nights. I could have fixed it in 10 seconds with a screwdriver and a memory. But I was not allowed in the building, and the man who had my job now did not know the relay existed. Inside that control room, I later learned a terrified young man Cameron had hired straight out of a marketing program was staring at a wall of screens he did not understand. The consultants had told him the system ran itself. The system was not running itself. It was dying, and it was taking the signal down with it. He did what the new handbook told him to do. He did not call an engineer because there were no engineers left. He called the technical support line, a call center Cameron had outsourced to save money, staffed by people 1,000 miles away who had never seen a transmitter in their lives. I can only imagine that conversation. The young man begging for help while the station sat silent. A pleasant, distant voice telling him to please hold while a ticket was created. The young man shouting that they were off the air, that thousands of people were listening to nothing, and the voice on the line calmly explaining that according to the system, the station was operating at full efficiency and someone would review the matter on Monday morning. The station was dark right now, and the machine said everything was fine. For 11 minutes, WBOY broadcast nothing but static. In the radio business, 11 minutes of dead air is a lifetime. It is a catastrophe. It is the kind of thing that ends careers and voids contracts. The old gospel listeners, the faithful ones who had trusted that frequency for 4 decades, turned their dials one by one and found other stations. Some of them, I am told, thought the old station had finally died along with the neighborhood it served. When the young man finally managed to reboot the whole system by unplugging it and praying the automation came back, but it came back wrong. It skipped the local programming and dumped straight into a block of national filler, cheap syndicated noise with no soul in it. The exact opposite of everything Denise and I had built. The gospel hour never came back that night. And here is the part that mattered most, the part Cameron would not understand until it was far too late. The sponsors were listening too. WBOY ran on the loyalty of local businesses. The funeral home, the auto shop, the 2 big grocery chains, the rib joint on Gratiot that had advertised with us for 25 years. These were not faceless corporations. These were neighbors who bought airtime because they trusted the voice of the station and because they trusted me. Their commercials were scheduled to run during that gospel hour. Instead, their paid spots vanished into 11 minutes of silence and a wall of national static. By the next morning, my phone, the prepaid one, was buzzing with word passed along from the old crew. 3 of our biggest sponsors had already called the station in a fury. The grocery chain that had been with us for 2 decades wanted to know why they were paying premium rates to broadcast dead air. The rib joint owner, a good man named Earl, whom I had known for 30 years, was threatening to pull every dollar and take it to a competitor. Cameron, I heard, did not even take the calls. He had an assistant tell them it was a minor technical matter, already resolved, nothing to worry about. He was too busy planning a party to worry about the people who actually paid the bills. But I worried about them. Those sponsors were my neighbors. Their trust was the real currency of that station, worth more than any contract with NovaStream. And Cameron was burning it 11 minutes at a time. I turned my radio dial back to WBOY. The national filler droned on hollow and cold. Somewhere out there, an old woman who had fallen asleep to that gospel hour every night for years was lying awake in the dark, wondering where the music had gone. "Do not worry," I told the empty room. "It is coming back. but first it has to go all the way silent. While the station bled listeners, 11 minutes at a time, Sasha threw a party with the money that was supposed to keep it alive. She called it the WBOY Rebranding Gala. She held it in the grand ballroom of a downtown hotel, the kind of place with crystal chandeliers and waiters in white gloves. There were ice sculptures shaped like the new pink logo. There were towers of champagne and trays of little foods nobody could pronounce. The flowers alone must have cost more than a new transmitter relay the very part that had just failed and knocked the station off the air. I knew where that money came from because I was the one who put it there. Years ago, I had set aside an emergency reserve, a separate account meant for exactly one thing: keeping the signal alive when the equipment failed on a cold night. It was insurance against disaster. Sasha had drained it to pay for a party. I found out about the gala the way I found out about everything from the old crew, and I decided I would attend. Not to make a scene, to deliver a warning because a part of me, the part that had raised that boy, still could not stand by and watch him drive off a cliff without at least tapping the brakes. I put on the charcoal suit Denise had given me for our anniversary, the good one, tailored to fit me 20 years ago. It was not slim or trendy, it was authoritative. I walked into that ballroom with my head up, and the room noticed. It started as a ripple near the door and spread like a wave until even the band faltered. Heads turned. Whispers followed me. "Isn't that the old man? I thought he was gone. Why is he here?" I did not look down. I did not hurry. I walked straight through the center of that crowd, and people parted for me, and the looks on their faces were not pity anymore. They were something closer to respect. Cameron saw me coming, and his practiced smile cracked. Sasha appeared at his side in a silver dress that probably cost a month of a driver's wages, and she looked me up and down and sneered. She asked if I had come to bust the tables since they were fully staffed. I looked at her and at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, and I knew exactly what it cost because I knew exactly how much had vanished from the reserve account. I told her it was a lovely bracelet. I told her it cost about the same as the transmitter part that failed on Thursday night, and I hoped it kept her warm when the invoices came due. The color drained from her face. She had not known that I knew about the fund. Cameron stepped between us, hissing at me to keep my voice down, telling me I was not on the list, that I was ruining the atmosphere. I leaned in close enough that the band covered our words from the room, and I made sure he heard every one. I told him his station had gone silent for 11 minutes on Thursday night. I told him 3 of his oldest sponsors were about to walk, that Earl from the rib joint had already called twice. I told him the relay that failed was a known weakness, one I had a plan to replace, and that he had fired the only men who knew how to nurse it through the winter. Cameron rolled his eyes. He told me the system showed everything running perfectly. Green across the board. "The system is a screen," I said. "The signal is real. You have a failure coming, son, not a small one. The whole chain of old equipment is due for service this month, and you spent the service money on ice sculptures. When it goes, it will not be 11 minutes. It will be everything." He laughed at me. He actually laughed right there in his silver ballroom and told me I was jealous. He said that was why he was in charge and I was out. He told me to go home and enjoy my retirement. I stepped back and looked at him with something close to pity. I told him I was going home, but I told him to remember this moment. Remember, I said that I stood in this room and told you the signal was failing, and you chose champagne over copper wire. When it all goes quiet, remember I warned you. Then I turned and walked out. I did not stay for the speeches. I did not touch the food. I walked out of that ballroom past the confused security and into the cold Detroit night. And I felt lighter with every step because I had done the last decent thing a father could do. I had warned him. What came next was on his own head. As I waited on the curb for a cab, the prepaid phone buzzed in my coat. It was Pops Willie. His message was short. It said the failures were spreading. The backup generator at the transmitter site was throwing warning codes. 2 more relays in the automation chain were reading red. The whole aging spine of the station, the parts that needed hands and ears and love to survive the winter, were all giving out at once, and there was no one left inside who knew how to save them. I looked back at the hotel, at the warm golden light spilling from the ballroom windows, at the silhouettes of Cameron and Sasha dancing inside a burning building. The oil was already on the floor, I thought. All it needed now was a spark. I texted Pops back. I told him to keep the old crew close and their tools ready. I told him Sunday was coming, and when it came, we would need to move fast. Then I climbed into the cab, gave the driver the address on the south side, and rode home through the dark, listening to a competitor's station on his radio, thinking about how quiet my own frequency had become. By Friday, the panic inside that glass building had reached a fever pitch, and a desperate man went digging for a miracle. Instead, he found a loaded gun and pointed it straight at his own foot. The failures had spread, just as I said they would. 2 relays down, the backup generator throwing red, sponsors fleeing, NovaStream sending sharp emails about delivery schedules and authentication deadlines. Cameron sat in the office that used to be mine in a chair he had not yet replaced and stared at the financial reports, searching for cash to stop the bleeding. He had already spent the reserve on Sasha's party. He needed money, and he needed a villain to blame for the emptiness. I knew he would find the payments eventually. I had all but left the trail for him to follow. Digging through 10 years of automated transfers, Cameron saw it. A recurring payment, $50,000 a month, flowing out of the operating company into an entity called Boyd Legacy Holdings. To a mind like his, a mind trained to look for shortcuts and schemes, this did not look like what it was. It looked like a smoking gun. I can picture the smile that spread across his tired face. He did not check the corporate registry. He did not ask the station's own lawyers what Boyd Legacy Holdings actually was. He did not read the master lease that explained every dollar. He simply saw money leaving the company and landing in an account controlled by me, the old man from the south side, and he decided he had finally caught me. He convinced himself that I had been skimming for years, that the reason the station was cash poor was not his own reckless spending, but decades of quiet theft by the founder. He did not realize that Boyd Legacy Holdings was the entity that owned the master tapes, the transmitter, and the very broadcast license he needed to stay on the air. He was looking at a rent check and calling it a robbery. But Cameron never cared much about facts. He cared about stories. And he had just found a story that could turn him from a failing executive into a hero who exposed corruption. A story that could explain away every failure of his short, disastrous reign. So he picked up the phone. He did not call the station's regular counsel because he knew they were loyal to the truth. He called a man named Sterling. I knew Sterling by reputation. He was not a lawyer you hired to solve a problem. He was a lawyer you hired to destroy a person. He specialized in the kind of scorched earth work that buries a man so deep he never sees daylight again. He arrived that afternoon in a black suit and spent 4 hours behind closed doors with Cameron, and together they built a lie beautiful in its cruelty. They drafted a complaint that painted me as a criminal mastermind. They claimed I had embezzled millions through a shell company over the course of a decade. They claimed the reason the equipment was failing was not Cameron's negligence, but my greed that I had been draining the maintenance funds for my own comfort while the station crumbled. It was a masterpiece of a lie. It took every one of Cameron's failures and hung them around my neck. And Cameron did not just want a lawsuit. I heard this later from a janitor still on the payroll, one of the few old faces they had not yet cleared out. Cameron told Sterling he wanted an arrest. He wanted handcuffs. He wanted the whole city to watch Isaiah Boyd, the man they had trusted for 40 years, be dragged out of his home like a common thief. He wanted to humiliate me the way he felt humiliated by his own collapsing empire. He wanted to erase me so completely that history would remember me not as the man who built WBOY, but as the crook who robbed it. He used the Boyd name and his family's standing to fast-track the whole thing. He fed the district attorney a story about a flight risk, an old man about to flee with stolen millions. He pushed it through channels that should have taken weeks, and he did it in a single afternoon. That evening, I was sitting in my apartment, reading my Bible by the light of a single bulb, when the story broke online. A local business blog had it first. The headline read that the former WBOY chairman was accused of a massive embezzlement scheme, and that the brave young chief executive Cameron Prince had uncovered the rot. I read it calmly. I looked around my small, dim apartment at the peeling wallpaper and the secondhand furniture. If I had stolen millions, I was doing a remarkably poor job of enjoying it. Cameron truly believed I was a thief. He could not imagine a world where a man works hard, plays fair, and structures his business honestly. He assumed everyone was a thief because he was one himself. He had stolen my company, so it followed in his mind that I must have stolen his money. I stood and went to the closet. I took out the charcoal suit again, brushed it clean, and laid it across the chair. I polished my shoes until they shone in the dim light. I was not going to meet what was coming in my pajamas, hunched and frightened, the way they wanted to find me. I was going to meet it standing straight, dressed like the man who built something out of nothing. I sat down in the wooden chair facing the door, folded my hands, and waited. I knew how these things worked. They would come at night for the spectacle of it, for the flashing lights in the dark to frighten the neighbors. At 9 o'clock, I heard the first siren far off, growing louder. Then a second. They were not being quiet. They wanted the whole block to know that a dangerous criminal was about to be taken. I closed my Bible, set it gently on the table, and stood to meet them. They came for me at 9 o'clock at night, with their lights flashing blue against the walls of my building, exactly the way I knew they would. I stood in the middle of my small apartment in my charcoal suit, my shoes shined, my tie straight, and I listened to the heavy boots come up the stairs. They were not quiet about it. They wanted every soul in that building to hear. Wanted the neighbors peeking through their chains to see a dangerous man taken away. I heard them reach the third-floor landing. I heard the fist come down hard on my door and a voice shout for me to open up. I did not make them break it down. My landlord was a decent woman with enough troubles of her own. I crossed the room and unlocked the door and swung it open myself. 3 officers stood there, hands resting on their belts, tense and ready for a fight. What they found instead was a 69-year-old man in a press suit, standing tall and calm in a tidy little room, a Bible on the table beside him. They hesitated, just for a breath. Then the lead officer asked if I was Isaiah Boyd. I told him I was. My voice did not shake. He told me I was under arrest for embezzlement, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. He asked me to turn around and put my hands behind my back. I turned slowly. I felt the cold steel close around my wrist tighter than it needed to be. I did not complain. I kept my head up. As they walked me out into the hallway, my neighbors were watching from their doorways. Old Mrs. Coleman from across the hall had her hand pressed over her mouth. The young couple from the end looked frightened half to death. I spoke to them gently as I passed. I told them it was all right. I told them it was a misunderstanding, that everything would be set right and they should go on back to bed. Even in handcuffs, a man can choose how he carries himself, especially in handcuffs. They walked me down the stairs and out onto the street, into the cold and the blinding blue and red light. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, the way crowds do, drawn to the flashing lights. And there, standing beside an unmarked black car in a long, expensive coat, was Cameron. He was smiling. It was a wide, hungry, victorious smile. He had come to watch. He had driven down to the south side to this poor block he despised, just to see them put me in the car with his own eyes. He raised his phone and took a photograph of me standing there in cuffs. "Smile, Isaiah," he called out over the noise. He said it was going to make a beautiful cover, The Rise and Fall of a Thief. The officer put a hand on my shoulder to steer me forward, but I planted my feet just for a moment, and I looked at Cameron across that crowd. I looked past the coat and the smirk and the phone. I looked right into the boy I had raised, and I saw nothing there but a hollow satisfaction that would not last the week. "You think you have won," I said loud enough to carry over the sirens. "You think this is the end of it." He laughed and waved his hand, playing to the small crowd, telling them to look at the criminal trying to make a speech. "But you have made one mistake tonight," I told him. "You wanted to silence me. Instead, you just handed me a microphone. And when I finally speak, son, the whole world is going to hear it." His smile flickered just for a second. Then he covered it with another laugh and told the officers to take me away, said he had a company to save from my mess. The officer guided my head down and eased me into the back seat of the squad car. The door shut with a heavy final sound, and the metal cage closed me off from the world. I leaned back against the hard plastic seat and let out a slow breath. Through the rear window, I watched Cameron shake hands with Sterling on the sidewalk, the two of them grinning like men who had just closed the deal of their lives. Cameron looked happier than I had seen him in years. I want to tell you something, whoever is still with me tonight. There is a particular kind of peace that comes to a man when he has done nothing wrong and knows it, even as the handcuffs bite into his wrists. The world can put you in a cage. It can flash its lights and print its headlines and let strangers on the street decide you are guilty. But it cannot touch what you know to be true. It cannot reach the quiet place inside where your conscience is clean. I sat in that cage with a clean conscience, and I was not afraid. Because Cameron did not understand what he had just done. In his rage to destroy me, he had escalated our quarrel from a business dispute into a criminal case. He had brought in the police and the courts and the public record. And by having me arrested for collecting my own rent, he had just walked through the third and final door of that lease agreement. The one that said no legal action could be taken against the rights holder without voiding everything. He had sued his own landlord for entering his own building. He had lit the last fuse himself. The car pulled away from the curb. The blue light swept across the tired old buildings of my neighborhood. The neighborhood that made me, and I closed my eyes and thought of Denise. Friday night was the sacrifice, I told her quietly. But Sunday is the resurrection. The holding cell smelled of bleach and old sweat, a smell I knew from my youth from before the station, when I was just a poor kid from the east side trying to keep my head above water. They put me in a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor. On the wall, a television played the late news and my face was on it. They had dug up an old photograph, a booking photo from a protest I joined in my 20s, standing up for the very neighborhood I would spend my life serving. Beside it, they showed Cameron polished and grave playing the heartbroken young executive who had uncovered the rot. In the space of 3 hours, Cameron had taken a reputation I spent 40 years building and set it on fire. To the city that night, I was no longer the man who sponsored the youth choir and fed families at Thanksgiving. I was a thief. The shame should have crushed me. It did not. I felt only a cold, steady resolve. Paint washes away. Documents are written in ink. The heavy door buzzed, and a detective came in, a tired man with a coffee stain on his tie. He sat across from me, opened a thick folder, and said his name was Reyes. He told me they had the bank records, $50,000 a month for years flowing into a shell company I controlled. He said it looked very bad. I folded my hands on the cold table. I did not slouch. "It looks bad, detective." I told him, "because you are looking through a keyhole. You see the money leave. You are not asking where it goes or why." He tapped the file and said it went to me, that I was the sole owner of Boyd Legacy Holdings, paying myself with company money. That this was embezzlement. I shook my head slowly. "No, detective," I said. "That is rent." He paused and looked up from the folder. I leaned forward and spoke plainly. "Boyd Sound and Radio," I told him, "is an operating company. It employs the staff and sells the airtime, but it does not own the transmitter. It does not own the master recordings in the vault. It does not even own the broadcast license or the name WBOY. Every one of those assets belongs to a separate holding company, Boyd Legacy Holdings, which I built 10 years ago to protect them. The station leases all of it from me every month for a fee." He frowned and said he did not see any lease agreements in his file. "That is because Cameron did not give them to you," I said. "He does not know they exist. He found a payment schedule and assumed it was theft. Pull the corporate charter filed with the state 10 years ago, and you will find a master service agreement that explains every dollar. That $50,000 is not stolen money, it is a discount. The market rate would be double." Detective Reyes stopped tapping his pen. He was a seasoned man, and he knew the difference between a criminal and a businessman when it was laid out in front of him. He said slowly that if this was true, there was no crime. Only a business dispute. "It is not even a dispute," I told him. "It is a contract, and by having me arrested for collecting on it, Cameron has just triggered a default clause he never read." The door opened again, and this time it was the precinct captain, a man named Booker. I recognized him at once. We had served together on a community board years back, raising money for the youth center. He looked at me, then at the file, and his face filled with confusion. "Isaiah," he said, "what in the world is going on? The district attorney tells me you are the biggest fraud case of the year, and I come down here and find you sitting like you are chairing a meeting." I greeted him warmly. I told him his detective was just now realizing he had been used as a pawn in a corporate takeover. I explained it again, the holding company, the license, the payments. I watched the understanding settle over Booker's face. He was a sharp man, and he did not like it. He realized his department had been manipulated by a vindictive stepson to settle a family score with a badge and handcuffs. "So let me get this straight," Booker said, leaning against the wall. "You are not stealing money, you are the landlord, and the tenant called the police on you for collecting the rent." "That is an accurate summary," I told him. He turned to Reyes and told him to check the state database right now. The room went silent except for the clicking of keys. 2 minutes later, Reyes looked up pale. He said it was all there. Boyd Legacy Holdings registered legitimate, the agreement public and on file. Every word of it legal. Booker let out a long breath. Then he walked over and with his own hands unlocked the cuffs from my wrists. The steel fell away and the blood rushed back. He told me he was sorry. They had acted on a warrant sworn by the chief executive, he said, and they had to bring me in. I rubbed my wrists and told him I understood. He was doing his job. But now I said, "I need one favor." He looked wary and asked what kind. "Release me quietly," I said. "Do not announce it. Let the story stand for the weekend. Let Cameron believe I am still sitting in this cell. Because there is a shareholder meeting Monday morning, and I want that boy to feel the full weight of his victory before I take it back." Booker studied me a long moment. He saw the fire behind the calm. He said they could release me on my own recognizance, and if I happened to slip out the back and avoid the reporters, that was not something he could control. I thanked him, signed the paperwork with a steady hand, and walked toward the rear door. Sunday was coming, and I had a resurrection to prepare. Sunday was supposed to be their victory lap. While I sat in my apartment reading by lamplight, Cameron and Sasha were popping corks in the penthouse office, celebrating a thief they had put in a cage. They had forgotten who wrote the code that ran the whole machine. I had built a failsafe into the heart of the station's systems 10 years earlier with the help of a young engineer I trusted. It was a simple thing, a few lines buried deep in the automation, a dead man's switch. Every day, the system reached out to the servers of Boyd Legacy Holdings to confirm the license was valid. If it ever received the signal that a hostile legal action had been taken against the rights holder, it would read that as a breach and it would shut itself down. At 1 minute before noon on Sunday, Cameron was the head of a media empire. At noon and 1 second, he was the captain of a sinking ship. It did not happen with an explosion. It happened with a flicker. In the master control room, the wall of screens that showed the signal flowing out across the city, the automation, the sponsor logs, the broadcast feed, all of it went dark at once. Then, on every screen in that building, a single message appeared, in white letters on a field of red. "License revoked. Broadcast rights terminated due to breach of contract. Contact the rights holder immediately." Cameron would not have understood it at first. But then the sound went. Out across the whole east side of Detroit, on every radio tuned to 890 on the dial, the music simply stopped, and in its place came a low, endless hiss. Static. The same static I had promised my wife at the graveside. It rolled out over the city like a fog, into kitchens and cars and hospital rooms, into every corner that frequency had ever reached for 40 years. WBOY was gone. And this time, it was not 11 minutes. This time, there was no coming back, because the man who held the only key was sitting in a rented room on the south side with his Bible on the table. I have imagined that penthouse 1,000 times. Sasha screaming at the red screens because she hated ugly things, and this was ugly. Cameron pounding on a dead keyboard, calling the young marketing kid he had made head of technology, the kid stammering that it was not just the office, it was everything. The transmitter, the vault, the whole system locked behind a wall of military-grade encryption, asking for a key that Cameron did not have and could not buy. And then the phones would have started. First the reception desk, then the emergency line, then all of them at once, A wall of ringing. Furious sponsors. The FCC field office asking why a licensed station had dropped off the air with no notice. And worst of all, NovaStream, because NovaStream had been counting on that catalog. The moment the license was revoked, every master recording Cameron had promised to deliver was flagged as unauthorized. Their whole distribution platform, the one they had built their Detroit deal around, lit up with copyright violations. 40 years of our music, the songs that raised up half the artists in this city, all of it went dark on their service in a single instant, because none of it had ever legally been Cameron's to give. I found out later that Grayson called Cameron himself, his voice cold as lake ice. He did not shout. Men like Grayson do not need to. He told Cameron the uptime guarantee had been breached, that the authentication had failed, that the penalty clause was now in force. $50 million. And since he knew the operating company did not have $50 million or $5 million or much of anything after Sasha's party, NovaStream was exercising its lien. They were freezing every account. Every dollar the station brought in would now flow straight to them until the debt was paid. Cameron did not have the money. He had spent the reserves on ice sculptures. He had promised a fortune he did not own to a shark who had been circling from the start. But the true weight of it did not land until Sterling arrived. I heard about this from a board member later who was in the building that night. Sterling, the lawyer Cameron had hired to destroy me, came into that red-lit office, pale and shaking, clutching the original incorporation documents he had finally dragged out of the basement archive. He had spent the day reading the master source agreement, the one written 20 years ago that nobody had ever bothered to open. He found the unlock protocol. The system, he explained, had been designed with a single override, a failsafe on the failsafe. In the event of a total lockdown triggered by a license dispute, only the biometric authorization of the registered rights holder could reset it. Not a password, not the board, not a court order fast enough to matter. Cameron, hope flickering in his exhausted eyes, said, "Fine, they would get an engineer. They would find a workaround." Sterling shook his head. "It was not any fingerprint," he said. "The contract was specific. Only the registered owner of Boyd Legacy Holdings could bring the system back to life, and if that owner did not personally authorize the reset within a set number of hours, the failsafe would begin to wipe the archive, the master tapes, the financial records, the whole 40-year memory of the station. Permanent deletion. Everything gone to silence." Cameron went very still. He looked at the red screens, he looked at Sterling, and he whispered the name of the only man on earth who could save him. Isaiah. The man he had mocked at a funeral, the man he had thrown out into the rain, the man he had just put in handcuffs and paraded before the cameras of the whole city. Sterling closed the binder. He told Cameron he had better pray that old man was in a forgiving mood, because right now, he said, Isaiah Boyd was not just the chairman. He was holding the only key to heaven, and Cameron was a sinner standing at a locked gate. Across the city, in my little apartment, I turned my radio dial to 890 and listened to the long, clean hiss of static roll on and on. Then I turned it off, and I sat in the quiet, and I waited for the phone to ring. The penthouse that had been a throne room at noon was a sinking ship by midnight, and the two people who had crowned themselves were tearing at each other in the red glow of the dying screens. I was not there to see it, but I had been told the shape of that night by people who were, and I know Cameron and Sasha well enough to fill in the rest. The office that had cost a fortune to make cold and white and modern was now bathed in the hellish red of the lockdown message. License revoked. It did not blink. It did not change. It simply glowed hour after hour, like the eye of a judgment they could not escape. The phones had finally stopped ringing, not because the crisis had passed, but because there was no one left to answer and nothing left to say. The sponsors had given up. The FCC had logged its violation, and NovaStream had already begun the slow legal work of stripping the company to the bone. Cameron paced the length of that office, his tie hanging loose, his fine suit wrinkled and dark with sweat. He had spent hours on the phone, screaming at IT firms who told him the same thing in a dozen different ways. The system could not be broken. The encryption was built to military standard. Without the rights holder's authorization, they would need 100 years and a supercomputer to crack it. He had thrown one phone against the wall, hard enough to leave a dent. It did not help. And through it all, the debt kept climbing. Every hour the station sat dark, the NovaStream penalties compounded, every account frozen, payroll due at the end of the week with nothing behind it. Cameron was watching his empire dissolve in real time, and there was not a single thing his money or his degree or his fine words could do to stop it. That was when Sasha turned on him. She had been sitting on the leather sofa, scrolling through her phone, watching the world she had built online catch fire. The drivers of the neighborhood were posting about the silence on the dial. Old listeners were asking what happened to their station. The gossip pages had already found the arrest story, and now the whispers were turning because a company does not collapse in a single afternoon unless something is deeply, terribly wrong at the top. "You idiot," she hissed and threw her phone onto the cushion. "You told me you had this handled. You told me the old man was finished." Cameron wheeled on her. He told her he had handled it. He had put Isaiah in a cell. How was he supposed to know the man had booby-trapped the whole system? "Because you are the one who runs it now," she screamed. "That was your job, to know. But you do not know anything, do you? You just wanted the title and the office and the parties." He told her not to talk to him that way. He told her he had made her who she was, that without him, she was nobody. And she laughed at him, a cruel and brittle sound, and told him that without Isaiah, he was nobody too. She told him he had fired the only people who understood the machine, arrested the only man who could fix it, and burned her reputation to the ground in the process. She said the whole city was laughing at them. The clueless couple who killed a 40-year-old station in a week. Cameron demanded to know where the reserve money was, the emergency fund he needed now to fight NovaStream and make payroll. Sasha crossed her arms and told him flat and cold that she had spent it. All of it. On the gala. The flowers, the champagne, the ice sculptures, the bracelet. She had wanted them to look rich, she said. She had wanted the whole city to see they were better than the old man. Cameron stared at her. $300,000. The last money that could have bought them time gone on a single night of pretending. He grabbed his own hair and pulled at it, and for a moment, I think he understood, truly understood, what they had done to themselves. "You are pathetic," Sasha spat at him. "You are broke and you are finished, and I am not going down with you. I am going to my mother's house." She turned for the door, but Cameron stepped in front of her. He told her she was not going anywhere. She had signed the checks too. If he went down for negligence, she would go down for the money she had stolen. They stood there in the red light, two people who had promised to love each other, hating each other completely, now that the money had stopped flowing between them. Two rats on a sinking ship fighting over the last dry crumb. And then, in the middle of that ruin, a new fear settled over Cameron, colder than all the rest. Sterling's words. The failsafe was already counting down. Somewhere in the locked heart of the system, a clock was ticking toward the moment it would begin erasing everything. The master tapes, the records, 40 years of a family's work about to be wiped into permanent silence, unless one man touched a scanner and brought it back. One man. The man he had spent a week destroying. Cameron looked at the phone on the desk, the private line, and he knew what he had to do. He knew it was the one thing his pride could not survive. He would have to call the stepfather he had mocked over a coffin. He would have to beg the man he had thrown into the rain, the man he had paraded before the cameras in handcuffs. He would have to admit out loud that without the old mechanic, he was nothing at all. His hand shook so badly he could barely dial. He had to steady it with the other. And somewhere out on the south side of the city, in a small apartment with peeling wallpaper, my prepaid phone began to ring. The phone rang at 2 o'clock in the morning. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I wanted him to wonder for just a moment whether I would answer at all. I was sitting in my armchair in that small apartment, a cup of chamomile tea going cold on the table, an old jazz record turning low on the player Denise had given me. I was calm. I had been waiting for this call since the day that boy handed me an envelope over his mother's funeral flowers. On the 4th ring, I picked up. I did not ask who it was. "Hello, Cameron," I said. There was a pause, and then his voice came through high and breathless, trying to sound casual and failing. He said he hoped he had not woken me. He said they were having a bit of a situation down at the station. A technical situation. A situation, I repeated. Is that what you are calling it? He gave a nervous little laugh and said the system seemed to have locked up. Some old legacy code, the IT people said. He figured since I knew the old systems better than anyone, that I might come down and take a look. Give them a hand. He said they could pay me a consulting fee. I took a slow sip of cold tea. The nerve of that boy was a wonder to behold. He had me arrested 6 hours ago, paraded me before the cameras of the whole city, and now he was offering me a consulting fee. You want me to come down there, I said slowly, to the building you banned me from, to help the company that fired me, to assist the man who put me in handcuffs tonight. He went quiet. I could hear his breathing ragged and shallow. Then the false calm cracked, and what was underneath came pouring out. He said we should not dwell on the past. He said the arrest was a misunderstanding, that the lawyers had gotten overzealous, that he could make it all go away by morning. He would drop the charges. He would fix everything. You can drop the charges, I said, letting the words hang there. That is generous of you, but I am not worried about the charges, Cameron. The police already know the truth. They know who owns the license. They know that station has been broadcasting on rights that were never yours to hold. The last of his composure fell away then, and the panic took over completely. He begged me to just turn it back on. He said they were losing millions. He said the sponsors were gone. The FCC was calling. NovaStream was freezing every account they had. He said the whole thing would be bankrupt by sunrise. And then he reached for the one card he thought might still work on an old man. He said, do it for the employees. You always said you cared about them. Prove it. I set down my tea and stood, and I walked to the window and looked out at the dark, quiet street. I do care about them, Cameron, I said. That is exactly why I am doing this. I am saving the station from you. He shouted that I was destroying it, that if they defaulted on NovaStream, they were finished. You are finished, I said. Not the station. You. There is a difference, and by Monday morning, everyone in that boardroom is going to understand it. His voice broke. He was crying now. I could hear the sob catch in his throat, the sound of a proud man coming apart. He told me he would give me anything, a seat on the board, the chairman's title back. He said he did not know the passwords, did not know the protocols, that he could not do this alone. He said, and this is the part I will remember, that he was scared. He said, please help me, I need you. And for one moment, one single moment, I felt it. A twinge of the old love. I remembered a 9-year-old boy on my shoulders at a ballpark, laughing. I remembered teaching him to ride a bike on Mack Avenue, running behind him with my hand on the seat. Then I remembered him checking his phone during his mother's eulogy. I remembered him laughing as the police put me in that car. I remembered Pops Willie, 71 years old and half blind, weeping in my doorway because that boy had taken his pension to save a few dollars. He was not sorry for what he had done. He was only sorry it had finally caught up with him. And if I saved him now, he would learn nothing. He would wait 6 months and reach for the knife again. I am not coming down, Cameron, I said. He gasped. He said I had to. He said everything would be erased. No, I said. I do not have to. You wanted to be the man in charge. You wanted to sit in the big chair and run the show. Well, son, this is what being in charge feels like. It feels like weight. It feels like every soul in that building on your shoulders at 2 in the morning. You cannot outsource this. You cannot hire a consultant to carry it for you. This is the job you took from me. Now you know what it weighs. He was still begging when I spoke again, quiet and final. I will see you Monday morning, I told him. At the shareholder meeting. I suggest you spend the hours between now and then writing your resignation. Because when I walk into that room, I am not coming as your stepfather. I am coming as the man who holds the note on everything you thought you owned. But I cannot fix it, he wailed. I know, I said. That is the point. Good night, Cameron. And I hung up the phone. On the other end, in that red-lit office, I imagine he sat with the dial tone buzzing in his ear, that flat and endless sound of a door closing for good. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, and I felt sad. the way you feel at the end of a long funeral. But I did not feel wrong. I turned the jazz record back up just a little, and I let Denise's favorite song carry me toward morning. Monday morning came gray and cold, but inside the boardroom on the top floor of the WBOY tower, it felt like the last hour of a long, dark winter. I stood outside the double doors and listened to the chaos on the other side. 20 people sat around that long table, the board members, the shareholders, the men and women who controlled the money. And right now, they were circling Cameron like wolves around a wounded animal. I could hear a man named Whitfield, who represented a pension fund that held a large share of the company, shouting that they had lost everything, that the station had been dark for 18 hours. That NovaStream was seizing the accounts and the FCC was threatening to pull the license for good. I could hear Cameron trying to answer, his voice thin and cracked, a shadow of the smooth young executive who had fired me a week before. He told them it was a negotiation, that the old man would come around. He sounded like a boy who had wet the bed and was blaming the weather. I looked at the team standing behind me. To my right was Renata, calm and sharp, holding a thick leather binder that carried the truth. To my left stood Pops Willie. He was not in a suit. He was in a crisp, new WBOY engineer's jacket, his name stitched fresh over his heart where the old patch had been torn away. Behind Willie stood 10 more of them. The senior crew, Cameron had thrown out with the trash. Old Sam from the transmitter, Miss Loretta from traffic, the dispatchers, the board operators, the ones who knew how to make that station breathe. I looked at Pops. I asked him if he was ready. He cracked his big knuckles and looked at those doors with his one good eye. He said he had been ready since the day they tore the patch off his jacket. He said, "Let us go take back our house." I reached out and pushed the doors open. They swung inward with a heavy, deliberate weight, and the noise in that room died all at once, like someone had pulled the plug on a speaker. 20 heads turned toward the door, and they saw me. Isaiah Boyd, the man they had been told was sitting in a jail cell, the man the whole city believed was a thief. I did not walk in quietly. I walked in with the slow, steady stride of a man crossing a floor he owns. My people came in behind me and fanned out along the wall, Willie at my shoulder, his presence filling the room with the quiet strength of an honest lifetime. Cameron stared at me, his mouth fell open. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. He whispered my name. I ignored him. I walked the length of that table to the empty chair at the far end, directly across from him, and I set my hands on its back and looked around at every face in that room. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," I said, and my voice filled the space without my ever raising it. I apologize for being late. I was detained over the weekend by a misunderstanding involving your chief executive and the police department. Whitfield looked at me, confused and relieved all at once. He said they had been told I was in custody, held without bail. "A misunderstanding," I said again. "But I am not here to talk about my weekend. I am here to talk about your debt." Cameron shot to his feet, knocking over a glass of water that spread dark across the polished wood. He shouted that I could not be there, that I was trespassing, that I was a criminal, and he pointed toward the corner of the room where the head of security stood. It was Mike, the same guard who had watched ashamed the day they walked me out into the rain, the same man whose daughter's hospital bills I had quietly helped cover 2 winters back. Cameron screamed at him to remove me. Now, a direct order. The whole room held its breath. Cameron was still technically the chief executive. To disobey him was insubordination. Every eye turned to Mike. He looked at Cameron. He looked at the water dripping off the edge of the table. He looked at the panic on the face of a boy playing king. And then he looked at me and at Pops Willie in his engineer's jacket, and at the row of loyal old faces along the wall. Mike took a step forward. He adjusted his belt. He looked Cameron dead in the eye. "I am sorry, Mr. Prince," he said, his voice steady and deep, "but I cannot do that." Cameron's face went red. He sputtered that he paid Mike's salary, that he was giving an order. "No, sir," Mike said. "You sign the checks, but the company pays the salary. And the way the bylaws read, security answers to the board. Right now it looks to me like the board wants to hear what Mr. Boyd has to say." "You are fired," Cameron shrieked. "All of you, get out!" Nobody moved. The silence in that room was heavy as stone. It was the sound of power shifting, of gravity itself changing direction. Cameron was shouting at a storm and ordering the wind to obey him, and the wind did not so much as stir. I pulled out the chair at the head of the table, the one Denise had bought for me a lifetime ago, and I sat down. It groaned softly under my weight, a familiar and welcome sound like an old friend saying my name. "Sit down, Cameron," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried 40 years of authority. It was the voice that had guided that station through blizzards and lean winters and hard nights. It did not ask permission. Cameron looked around the room. He saw the board turned against him. He saw Mike with his arms crossed. He saw Willie glaring at him and old Sam and Miss Loretta. He saw that he was completely, utterly alone. Slowly, he sank back down into his chair. I turned to the board and I nodded to Renata. She stepped forward and set the leather binder on the table and opened it to the truth. Renata did not raise her voice. She adjusted her glasses, looked around that silent table, and began to explain in a clear and clinical tone exactly how Cameron had inherited a kingdom made of nothing. "Mr. Prince is correct about one thing," she said. "He does own 51% of Boyd Sound and Radio, the shares his late mother left him. But he has never understood what those shares actually are." Cameron slammed his hand on the table and said they were the company. The transmitter, the building, the name, everything. "No," Renata said, "they are not. Boyd Sound and Radio is an operating company, a service shell. It employs the staff and sells the airtime, and that is all. Every real asset, the transmitter, the master recordings, the broadcast license, the very name, WBOY, belongs to Boyd Legacy Holdings, which is owned entirely by Mr. Isaiah Boyd." The room went still. Whitfield leaned forward and asked her to say that again. She held up a diagram, 2 boxes, one small and hollow, one large and full. "For 10 years, she said, the station has leased everything it uses from Mr. Boyd. The tower, the software, the catalog, the name. Mr. Prince did not inherit a business. He inherited a lease. He is a tenant. Mr. Boyd is the landlord." "But my mother left me the company," Cameron stammered. "She left you the job," Renata said. "She and Mr. Boyd agreed years ago that the real assets would stay protected in the holding company, so that if the management ever failed, the family's life work could not be sold off or lost." I spoke then, my voice low and rough as gravel. "She built that safeguard for exactly this day, Cameron," I said. "She knew someone might come along who cared more about the logo than the labor. Someone who would spend the emergency fund on a party and fire the men who kept the signal alive. She made certain that person could never sell off 40 years of our music to buy himself a bigger office." "So what does that mean?" Cameron whispered. "It means," Renata said, closing the binder with a sharp snap, "that you own 51% of nothing. Your shares are in a company with no assets, whose only value came from its contracts with Mr. Boyd. And as of noon yesterday, those contracts are void." That was the drop of the blade. But Renata was not finished. She opened a second file. "And there is the matter of the reserve account," she said. "I completed a forensic audit of the company's spending over the past 6 months. The emergency fund meant to keep the signal alive was drained of $300,000 in a matter of weeks." She slid the bank statements down the table, and they fanned out like a losing hand of cards, line after line highlighted in yellow. $50,000 to an event planner for the gala, $20,000 to a jeweler for a diamond bracelet, $10,000 for a weekend at a spa, $15,000 for a personal wardrobe entered as a uniform redesign. The board gasped. Whitfield picked up a statement, his hands shaking, and said the word out loud. Theft. This was not mismanagement. This was criminal. From the doorway, a voice tried to explain it away. Sasha had slipped in during the meeting, and now she stepped forward pale. She said it was marketing. They had to look successful to attract investors. "A diamond bracelet is not marketing," Renata said, cutting clean through the lie. "And neither is the down payment on a sports car made from the payroll account last Friday. That is why the staff paychecks bounced this week. You did not just empty the reserve. You stole your own people's wages." Sasha burst into loud theatrical tears and pointed a shaking finger at her husband. "He made me do it," she wailed. "I did not know where the money came from." "You liar," Cameron screamed at her. "You chose the bracelet." And there they stood, screaming and clawing at each other in front of the whole board. The rot of them finally dragged into the light. They were not partners. They were accomplices who turned on each other the instant the heat rose too high. Then the doors opened again, and 4 officers walked in, followed by 2 detectives from the Economic Crimes Unit. These had come for a different kind of criminal. One detective held up a warrant. "Cameron Prince and Sasha Prince," he announced. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and fraud." Cameron froze. He looked at the police at the window, searching for a door that was not there. "This is a mistake," he whispered. Then he turned to me, his eyes wide and pleading, and he said the word he had not said in 20 years. "Dad." He whispered it. "Dad, tell them it was a misunderstanding, please." I did not look at him. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on the empty chair where he had sat. The chair Denise had bought, and I reached out and placed my hand flat on its cool leather arm. It was solid. It was real. It was the only thing in that room that mattered. The detective took Cameron by the arm, and the handcuffs closed with the same metallic click I had heard 3 nights before. But this time, the sound was justice. They led them out past the board members who turned their chairs away, past Pops Willie, who stepped aside without a word. Sasha screamed about her rights the whole way down the hall. When the doors finally closed, the room let out a long breath. The air felt lighter, cleaner, the infection cut out at last. "Get them out of here," I said quietly to the empty air. "That is my chair." The hardest part of any war is not the fighting, it is the cleaning up. The board meeting was over, and the police were gone with their prisoners, but the building was still full of the wreckage of Cameron's short, ruinous reign. Unpaid invoices, furious sponsors, and most of all, hundreds of frightened people who did not yet know whether the man who had just walked back in was here to save them or to finish what Cameron had started. So I went down to them. I did not summon them to my office. I took the elevator down to the ground floor to the main studio where the real work of the station had always happened. And I asked Mike to gather everyone. The engineers, the board operators, the sales staff, the janitors, the young hires, and the old hands alike. They came slowly, wary, and formed a loose half-circle around me on that studio floor. I did not stand on a riser or behind a podium. I stood on the same floor as them. And I looked out at that sea of tired faces, people I had known for 30 years, standing beside kids who had started the month before. And I told them the truth. "I owe every one of you an apology," I said. My voice carried easily in that room built for sound. I let this happen. I built this station to be a fortress, and then I left the front gate wide open. I thought that by stepping back, I was giving the next generation room to lead. Instead, I handed a loaded weapon to a boy who did not respect the people it was pointed at. And you are the ones who paid for my mistake. You lost sleep. You lost wages. Some of you lost your good name in a story that was never true. For that, I am truly sorry. The room was silent. They were not used to hearing the man in charge apologize. Cameron had never once said sorry in his life. But an apology does not put food on the table, I went on. And it does not promise this will never happen again. So I have decided to make sure it cannot. I nodded to Renata and she handed me a single sheet of paper. I told them that a company should not belong to one family alone, because bloodlines can weaken and hearts can turn. The only people who truly protect a thing are the ones who bleed for it every day. Then I read them the change. Effective immediately, 30% of the ownership of the new company was being placed into a trust held by the employees. Not the executives, the workers. The engineers, the operators. The people who came in at 4 in the morning to keep the signal alive. A murmur ran through the crowd. They looked at one another, not sure they had heard right. "It means you are not just employees anymore," I said, raising my voice. "It means you are owners. When this station profits, you profit. When it grows, your families grow with it. And it means that never again can anyone sell this place out from under you, because now you hold a vote and a share of the very ground it stands on. The shock broke into smiles, and the smiles broke into something louder. It started with Pops Willie clapping his big scarred hands together, and then Mike joined him, and then the whole studio floor was shaking with it. It was not polite applause. It was the sound of relief pouring out of people who had spent a week believing they had lost everything. I spent the next 2 hours among them. I signed checks from my own personal account to cover the wages Cameron had let bounce every dollar before a single person had to ask. I listened to their worries. I rehired on the spot every senior hand who had been thrown out that terrible week, and I did it with a raise because loyalty that survives a betrayal is worth more than gold. I was tired down to my bones, but my heart was lighter than it had been in years. When it was done, I called Pops Willie into my office. He was still in his engineer's jacket, and I had a small box waiting for him on the desk. Inside was a new badge. It read, Director of Sound. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers, and I watched his one good eye fill. Isaiah, he said, I fix drums and I nurse old transmitters. I do not sit in meetings. I do not know how to wear a tie. You do not need a tie, Willie, I told him. You need your ears. Cameron threw out the experts because they frightened him. I am promoting the experts because I cannot run this place without them. You know more about the soul of this station than any consultant with a clipboard ever will. I need you to run the sound to train the young ones to make certain that never again does this frequency fall silent on a cold night for lack of a good man in the room. He held that badge against his chest, and his voice shook when he thanked me. I told him to save it. There was work to do. Because there was one thing left, the thing the whole city was waiting for, without even knowing it. Out there across the east side, the dial at 890 was still nothing but static. 40 years of a neighborhood's voice reduced to an empty hiss. I walked with Willie down the hall to the master control room, the heart of the whole operation. The red lockdown screens were still glowing patient and cruel, waiting for the one hand that could turn them off. I looked at my old friend, this half-blind 71-year-old drummer that a foolish boy had called a fossil, and I put my hand on his shoulder. Pops, I said, let us go put this city back on the air. Pops Willie pressed his thumb to the scanner, and 40 years of silence came to an end. We stood together in the master control room, the two of us, an old chairman and an older drummer, watching the wall of angry red screens. Willie set his thumb against the reader the way I had authorized that morning, adding his print to the system as the new director of sound. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the red flickered. It faded to black, and one by one, like stars coming out at dusk, the green lights returned. The signal meters woke. The transmitter hummed back to life. The heartbeat of the station began to thump again. Willie did not reach for the automation. He reached for a record. He pulled an old vinyl from the shelf, one of the first we ever cut in that garage. Denise humming underneath a gospel choir, and he set the needle down with hands that had kept time for half a century. And across the whole east side of Detroit at 890 on the dial, the static broke and the music came back. I have been told what that moment was like out in the city, and it is the part of this story I hold closest. In a diner on Gratiot, an old man who had eaten breakfast to that station for 30 years looked up from his coffee when the sound returned, and he had to wipe his eyes. In a hospital room, a woman who had fallen asleep to the gospel hour every night of her long illness heard it come back, and she smiled in the dark. Cars on the freeway, kitchens across the neighborhood, barber shops, and church basements, all of them caught the same wave at the same moment, and the word went out that WBOY was home. The neighborhood had its voice again. That is what Cameron never understood. He thought a radio station was a tower and the logo and the contract. It was never any of those things. It was the sound of a community talking to itself. It was Denise humming in the dark. And you cannot buy that, and you cannot rebrand it, and you cannot fire the men who carry it and expect it to survive. While the music played, the world was finishing its judgment of the two people who had tried to kill it. The internet is a cruel and honest court. For years, Sasha had built a perfect life online. She had posted her clothes, her cars, her vacations, all of it paid for. We now knew with money stolen from the very people who kept the station running. She had made strangers envy her. But the moment the arrest hit the news, the curtain was torn down, and the crowd that had envied her turned on her all at once. Her mugshot spread across every platform before the ink was dry, her makeup running, her hair a ruin. People pulled apart her old posts, pointing to the stolen money in every photograph. "That bracelet," one comment read, "was bought with a blind man's pension." Her followers, once in the hundreds of thousands, vanished almost overnight. The brands that had paid her cut her loose. She had lived for the applause of strangers, and now she was dying by their scorn. She had lost her freedom. But for a woman like Sasha, the loss of the audience was the deeper wound. She was no longer an influencer. She was a cautionary tale. As for Cameron, the lawyers were already saying the evidence was too clean, and the arrogance too public for him to walk. He was looking at years. He would spend the best of them in a cell, thinking about the empire he had held in his two hands and crushed out of pure vanity. He would have a long time to learn the one lesson he had never bothered to hear: the difference between the price of a thing and the value of it. I did not celebrate any of it. There is no joy in watching a boy you once carried on your shoulders destroy himself. I felt only the quiet, heavy peace of a debt that had finally been settled, the way you feel when a long storm passes and the air goes still. The sun was setting over the city as I walked the empty halls one last time that day. The red screens were gone. In their place, the steady green glow of a station doing what it was born to do. I turned off the lights in the boardroom. I stood a moment in the doorway, in the spot where Cameron had stood and begged, and I found the ghosts had already gone. I took the elevator down to the garage. My company car sat polished in its reserved spot, but I walked right past it. In the far corner, under a flickering light, sat my old pickup truck, 30 years old and faithful as a hound. I climbed in. The door creaked. The cab smelled of old leather and dust and honest years. I turned the key, and the engine answered me with its low and steady rumble, the most beautiful sound I know, because it is the sound of something that has never once let me down. I pulled out onto the street. I did not drive home. I turned north toward the cemetery with a set of keys in my coat pocket and something I needed to say to the only person who would ever truly understand it. The city rolled by my windows alive with light, and somewhere out there in 1,000 homes, faint through the walls of the passing cars, I could hear my station playing, carrying Denise's voice back out into the night where it belonged. The gates of the cemetery were open, and I drove slow along the winding path until I reached the hill where I had laid Denise to rest just 2 weeks before. I parked the old truck and stepped out into the cold, still night. The wind had died down. It was quiet in a way the city never is, a deep and holy quiet. I walked to her grave. The earth was still fresh. The flowers Cameron had ordered for the funeral had long since browned and died, and I cleared them away with my hands and set them aside. Then I lowered myself down onto the grass, my knees complaining the whole way, and I knelt beside my wife. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the set of keys. The keys to the station. The keys to the vault the master control the front door of everything we had built together, from a borrowed microphone and a dream. The same keys that boy had demanded from me over your funeral flowers, Denise. I set them gently on the cold face of the headstone. "I did it," I whispered. "I saved it. It got messy, and I had to be harder than you ever knew me to be. For a few days there, I was a man you might not have recognized. But the house is clean now. The people are safe. Pops Willie has his job and his pension, and the young ones have a future. And the boy has been stopped before he could do any more harm. Thank God it is over." I touched the cold stone. "I miss you," I said. "The silence in this world is loud without you in it. But I am going to keep working. I am going to teach these young ones what you taught me." Let me tell you what she taught me, whoever you are, still sitting with me at the end of this long night. She taught me that a legacy cannot be given. It has to be earned. Cameron believed that respect came bundled with the stock certificates, that a man could inherit the trust and the standing along with the shares. But he found out the hard way that respect is a currency you have to mint yourself every single day with your own 2 hands. It cannot be handed down. It cannot be bought. You earn it, or you do not have it at all.
She taught me that silence is not the same thing as surrender.
For a whole week, the world thought I was finished, beaten, an old relic, swept aside by the future. But sometimes a quiet man is not a weak man. Sometimes the silence is just the low hum before the signal comes back stronger than before. Thank God for the patience He gives us to wait out the storm instead of raging against it.
And she taught me the thing I hold closest of all,
That the measure of a life is not the noise you make while you are here. It is not the towers you raise, or the contracts you sign, or the applause you gather. A legacy is not the signal you broadcast out into the world. It is the frequency you leave behind inside other people. It is Pop's Willie standing a little taller in his new jacket. It is a young engineer I trained who will train others long after I am gone. It is an old woman who falls asleep to a gospel hour that will still be playing when I have joined my Denise in the ground. That is what you leave. Not what you leave for people, what you leave in them. Thank God for the chance to leave something good. I knelt there a long while in the cold, and then I rose and I brushed the dirt from my knees. I left the keys resting on her stone because she was the one who truly held them all along. I looked out at the city lights glittering below, and they did not look like something to be conquered anymore. They looked like windows, homes, families waiting up a radio glowing warm in the corner of the room. I walked back to my old truck and climbed in and rested my hands on the wheel. I am 69 years old. I am alone now, in the way a man is alone when he has lost his other half. But I am not empty. I am the chairman of a station that belongs at last to the people who love it. And tomorrow morning there is good work waiting to be done. I put the truck in gear and drove out through the open gates. The road ahead was dark, but my headlights cut through it steady and bright. So let me leave you with what I have learned, friend. A legacy cannot be inherited. It has to be earned one honest day at a time. Hard work, loyalty, and knowing how to fix what you break will always outlast a fine suit and an empty promise. And no matter how old they say you are, no matter how much the world tells you that you have been left behind, the fundamentals never go out of style. Do not let anyone convince you that your years are a weakness. They are the whole song. If this story reached something in you tonight, do me one last favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so more stories like this can find their way to you. And leave me a comment. Tell me about a time you were underestimated. A time you had to remind the world of your true worth. I read every single one. Until next time, this is Isaiah Boyd. Keep your signal strong, keep your heart honest, and never let anyone tell you the old sound has nothing left to say.